I'm Michael Lumpkin, Director of AFI Festivals. Thank you again for joining us this evening. It is my pleasure to bring to the stage Mr. BRYAN Stevenson. NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford.
Let me tell you. Mrs. Park was right, Brother Stevenson. You must be tired, but you sure are brave.
Thank you.
Something you said really struck me. You said that you were broken, and we come from a broken community. And as a member of this broken community, I want to thank you on behalf of it for everything you're doing to heal it.
Thank you.
I want to jump right into it because you talked a lot about how the present-day criminal justice system is a function of a fact that America has not recognized its past with slavery. Today, what does that recognition look like?
Well, I think it would mean that we're going to have to understand all the ways in which we have become conditioned to be indifferent to the victimization of black people, to brown people, the way we have tolerated inequality. The Bureau of Justice today predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. Nobody was talking about that during the midterm elections. They're not likely going to talk about it at the debate. They're not going to talk about it in 2020. We've actually just accepted that as a phenomenon, and it wouldn't be acceptable if we actually understood that we are responsible for creating these conditions. And so I actually think that we have created so few places that talk honestly about slavery, that we haven't really dealt with the legacy of lynching is an indictment, and we've got to change that. When you go to Germany, you see this commitment, and there are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. Yet in this country, we have littered the landscape with all of this iconography. That's going to have to change. You know, there were hearings today on this question of reparations, and it gets kind of a flashy headline, but we actually haven't started talking about how we repair all of this damage. And so for me, that's what this is about. And I do think institutions that are responsible, like the US Supreme Court, have a role to play. And I wasn't kind of joking in the film. I actually think the US Supreme Court should issue a special opinion where they apologize for their decision in 1876 that allowed lynching to take place for 100 years. I do. And I think other courts ought to be thinking about the things they have done that have facilitated bigotry and violence and lawlessness and enslavement and segregation, and be thinking about what they now must do to change that. And I think that's the challenge. We're putting up markers at lynching sites all over the country. And when we put the markers up, we're actually we did one in Nashville today, we'll be doing one in Delaware, we'll be doing one in Orlando, Florida on Friday. But when we put these up, we actually want the sheriff and the police chief to show up. And I say you should wear your uniform, and you should have the courage to stand up and say to people of color in this community, I'm sorry that the people wearing this uniform failed to protect you 70 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. And then you should have the courage to say, I now wear the uniform, and I'm going to protect you. You don't need money, you don't need a budget, you don't need a legal decision, you just need a consciousness. And most places we go, the sheriff's unwilling to do that. The police chief is unwilling to do that.
Unwilling now.
Unwilling now.
In this day and age.
In this day and age. And so that's what has to change if we're going to get where we're trying to go.
You talk a lot about how this is uncomfortable for some people. What do we do with that discomfort, but more importantly, with the tension between this need for retribution and this need for redemption? For example, I went and did a story recently where we were talking about prisoners' rights to vote in New Hampshire and in Maine, the only two states where you can vote if you're behind bars. And we talked to the people who were victims of violent crimes, and they said, you shouldn't have a right to vote as an inmate if my brother or sister or son or whoever died doesn't have a right to even live. What do you do? How do you acknowledge their pain?
Well, I don't think we do very well for victims of violent crime in this country because we offer them things that aren't really helpful. If all you get for being the victim of a violent crime is this idea that will be really harsh and punitive and abusive toward the person who's offended you, you're not actually doing anything that actually restores, that helps people to recover. Our motto in this country is after you've been raped or murdered or beat up or murdered, we'll be really tough on the person who committed that crime. When there's actually something we could be saying and doing that actually prevented people from being raped and murdered. That means changing how we think about human behavior. And I just think we've done a really poor job of facilitating that because what we preach, and our politicians do this, is we preach fear and anger. We want to govern through fear and anger. We declared a misguided war on drugs in the 1970s. We said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. Now, we didn't have to say that. We could have said that people who have drug addiction and drug dependency have a health problem, and we need our healthcare system to respond to that problem. And had we made that choice, we wouldn't have sent hundreds of thousands of people to jails and prisons, and we wouldn't have wasted billions of dollars that might have been spent actually protecting people from violent crime. There are things we can do that will actually lower the level of violence. Things like gun control, things like interventions with young kids that are traumatized, things like education around what it requires to live healthy. But we're not doing those things. And so I really think we have reshaped what it means to be a offender and a victim. And I don't think we've done a very good job of being honest about that. I say in the film, and I really believe this, that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. If you want to go into communities where people are dealing with violent crime, you go to poor black communities, where the levels of violence are off the charts. And I know too many mothers who have children in prison for being accused or convicted of a crime and who have lost children to violent crime. And so it's not satisfying to say you're on one side or the other. We're actually on a continuum. Yeah, that's right. And we've got to deal with it from that perspective. But I think this whole consciousness about not wanting to do redemption, not wanting to do rehabilitation is a distraction created by people who are preaching to us be afraid and be angry. And I think fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice. And when we allow ourselves to be governed in that way, we tolerate things we shouldn't tolerate. If you had to reduce to the core element why there was the Holocaust, it was because of fear and anger. The genocide of Rwanda, fear and anger. The abuse of communities all across this country can be reduced to people preaching fear and anger. And we've allowed that to happen in this country when it comes to our criminal justice system. And that's why we're putting so many people wrongly in jails and prisons. And that has to be challenged. And it's not just partisan, but it begins in places like Washington. We've got to stand up against people who are preaching to us be afraid and be angry. When you hear the politics of fear and anger, we've got to demand more than that if we're really going to get someplace that's healthy. I've seen what it's done to communities of color, and it's created this legacy that we're talking about in this film.
When you talk about fear and anger, the response to that is something you said that was striking about the fact that truth and reconciliation are sequential. One has to come before the other. And when you think about that sequence, where are we now? I mean, where you started your career and where you are now, is there still some piece of the spectrum we're missing?
Oh, yeah, I think we're just starting, really, to begin this. I mean, when you think about it, this is the 400th anniversary of African Americans on this continent. We're just in the early days of the post-apartheid, post-lynching, post-enslavement era. And we haven't really started talking about these things. Who talks about the Native genocide in this country? What have we done to recognize that we are living in spaces as a result of violence against a whole community of people? We kept the words, right? And here in DC, Potomac and all these native words, but we made the people leave. And until we start talking about that, and Canada, you can't enter a place like this without beginning an event by acknowledging the memory of those people who were slaughtered to create these spaces. We opened this museum in Montgomery largely because there were no museums about slavery in America. We have the new African American History Museum here. We've opened our site. But it's the most consequential moment in American history, and we've dedicated almost none of our cultural resources to that era. This issue of lynching. Most people in America can't name one black person who was lynched between 1877 and 1950. Not one. And there were thousands. And I think that speaks to how little truth-telling we have done. And that's why we're so committed to putting markers at every lynching site in America. I think in Washington, they need to be marking the places where the domestic slave trade became a portal for trafficking that so disrupted this nation. I think these institutions that were complicit need to be acknowledging that history. In Johannesburg, you can't go into the Constitutional Court without walking past all of that symbolism and monuments and memorials that are designed to make sure no one forgets the inequality of apartheid. Because if we don't do that, we see what we now see. We see people profiting politically by demonizing groups based on their ethnicity or their national origin. We see the court retreating from the Voting Rights Act in the 2013 decision of Shelby County, because there is none of that memory. And I just think we're not going to get where we need to go if that doesn't happen. The powerful thing about truth-telling is that it does change you. I mean, that's the exciting thing. I've seen real change when we begin, but we haven't done enough of it to facilitate the kind of change that I think we need. And that's why we open these sites in Montgomery. We think it can be a portal for some of that.
You talk about remembering, but what about recording?
Mm-hmm.
What's the role of social media in all of this? Because when we were talking about your McMillian case, you were talking about witnesses who had been coerced. We've seen now this renewed interest in the Central Park Five because of what social media has done. Now people are losing their jobs because of their involvement in that case. Where would we have been then had we had social media? But more importantly, how critical is it to our lives now?
Right. Well, I mean, I do think it's important, but, I love Ava's film, but it begins with the film, right? Until there's the storytelling, there isn't the reaction. And I do think we need our storytellers to be more present in these spaces. There are too few films about slavery. There are too few films about lynching. There are too few films about segregation. We have 100 films about the Holocaust in this country, as we should. But where is the catalog of storytelling that helps us understand the brutality of the domestic slave trade, the brutality of lynching, the brutality of segregation, the brutality of racial inequality? We now tell the stories, and there is a reaction, is what we're seeing with that film. But we've got to do more to create that truth that people can respond to if we're going to actually see the kind of change that we need to see. And I don't think it's all good, right? Because we also have a lot of bigotry and ignorance and false narrative that takes up that space. So I think we have a lot to do. I do think storytellers, which is why a film festival is so important, I think we should try to be thinking about being more courageous in our willingness to engage on some of these topics. What are the big lynching films that we have created in this country? What are they? I'd love to see them. What are the films that actually help communities understand the brutality of slavery? And I just think there's a lot of work we haven't done that we need to do to then inspire that kind of conversation.
How do we do that, though? How do we take back the narrative? Because you say the South won the narrative. How do we, as a new generation, some in a community of African Americans, how do young African Americans redefine that narrative?
Well, I think it's partly learning the history. So we have a calendar. We put out a daily tweet about something in American history, and we begin to build a knowledge base that helps us understand how to talk about these issues. And then I think we have to do action. We have to do things. So in the film, we talked about the soil collections. We're going to lynching sites, and it seems kind of silly to people, but what I've seen happen up close is really powerful. We just did one not too long ago, and it was a middle-aged black woman who came, and she was unhappy because her sister didn't come with her, and she wasn't sure she would go out by herself without her sister. And we had our meeting like you saw in the film, and she kind of got fired up, and she said, I'm gonna go. And we gave her the jar, and we gave her the implement, and we gave her the memo to describe the lynching. And she went to this lynching site. It was in this remote place in West Alabama, and she parked her car. It was on a dirt road. And as soon as she got out to start digging, she said a man drove by in a pickup truck, big white guy. And he drove by and he slowed down and he saw her there. And then he turned around and he drove back by and he looked at her. And then he turned around and he drove by a third time. And then he got out of his truck. And she said she got so nervous. And we tell people when you're doing this, you don't have to explain to them what you're doing. You can say you're just getting dirt for your garden if you want to. And she said that's what she decided to do. And this man started walking over to her. And just as she expected, the man came up to her and he said, "What are you doing?" And she said she was going to tell him she was just getting dirt for her garden. But when she talked to us later, she said, "But when I was there and he asked me that question," she said, "something just got a hold of me." And the next thing I knew, I told him, "I am digging soil at this site because this is where a black man was lynched in 1931, and I'm going to honor his memory." And she said she started digging real fast because she didn't know. And she said the man stood there and at some point said, "Does that paper talk about the lynching?" And she said, "Yes." And then he said, "Can I read it?" And she said, "Yes." And she gave him the paper, and she was still digging. And she said the man read the paper, put the paper down, and did something that shocked her. She said the man said, "Excuse me, but can I help you?" Then he got down on his knees, and she offered him the little implement we give people to dig the soil. He said, "No, no, no, you keep that." And then she said he just threw his hands into the soil with such force, and he just threw his hands, and his hands were turning black with the soil, and he was putting it in the jar. And she said there was something about the way he was just throwing his hands into the soil that moved her. And before she realized it, she was crying. And the man looked at her and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Am I upsetting you?" And she said, "No, you're blessing me." And they kept digging and they kept digging, and they got near the top, and she noticed that the man was slowing down. And then she looked at him, and he was shaking. And then she saw that there were tears running down his face. And she said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "No, I'm just so worried that it might have been my people, my grandparents that lynched this man." And she said they both sat on the roadside for 20 minutes just crying. And at the end of it, he took a picture of her holding the jar, and she took a picture of him holding the jar. And it's not always the case that beautiful things happen when we put ourselves in position to do truth acts. But if we don't do truth acts, we deny ourselves the opportunity for that kind of reconciliation, that kind of hopefulness. And that's what we have to do. And we have opportunities every day of our lives, in our workplace, in our political places, in our social places, to actually engage in acts of truth-telling. And it's, for me, that's the challenge that we face in this country. Can we create an era? I don't want just a hearing. I don't want just a moment. I think we need an era of truth and reconciliation in this country where for decades we commit ourselves.
And I think, how do we do that on an individual basis? Because one of the most powerful moments I thought of the film was when you said we decided to look into the judges and the clerks, and we asked questions. And when you did that, you said, "Do you hire black clerks? Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the KKK is doing God's work?" Mm-hmm. How do we ask those questions? How do we create cultures of accountability in the justice system, in corporate America, in the spaces we're in each and every day?
Yeah, well, I do think it has to be an inquiry. It has to be, I'm going to understand the truth of my space. I'm going to understand the truth of my community. We've made it easier on the community side. We have, if you go to our website, we have maps. We can tell you the lynching history of every county in this country, and people should know their history. And then you have to investigate your truths in the spaces where you work. What is the history of inclusion here? What is the history of how we have invited people in? Is there a history of exclusion? Is there a history of bigotry? What do we say about that? What do we talk about that? You know, I'm not interested in punishing our nation for this history. Sometimes people think, you know, they hear me talking about this, "Oh, you just want to punish America." I have no interest in punishment. My interest is in liberation. It really is. I genuinely believe that the truth can set you free. And if we understand the truth, we can get to someplace better. I look at where we were on domestic violence 50 years ago, when we used to laugh. We never arrested the men who were accused of beating their spouses. We started talking truthfully about what it was like to be the victim of that violence, and the narrative has shifted, not where it needs to be. I look at how the narrative has changed on things like marriage equality in a relatively short period of time, but that was a narrative shift where we told the stories of what it meant to be in love and to not be blinded by these restrictions on who can love one another. And when we understood that, we opened up our hearts and our minds. We got to something that I think feels more like freedom. We're going to have to engage in that same kind of truth-seeking, that same kind of narrative effort when it comes to the history of race, and be willing to acknowledge the things that are wrong to just speak to the things that are wrong. The Supreme Court was wrong to declare that racial bias in the death penalty is inevitable. They were wrong to tolerate the kind of legal segregation that we tolerated for 100 years. It is wrong to demonize people as rapists because they're from Mexico, or to demonize people because they're Muslims. It's wrong to condemn communities because of where they are in the geography of this planet. And we've got to have a consciousness about that if we're going to get to a place that is whole and healthy, that allows us to actually experience the freedom that I think many of us seek.
You talk about being whole and healthy, but something you also talk about throughout the film and here is love. And it seems like you came from a community that was steeped in love. I've seen a couple of your family members here, even here tonight.
Yes.
And we thank them for supporting you and doing your work. But my last question, right? This is what the product of love looks like.
Yes.
But my last question for you tonight is, how can we help?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, and I am really fortunate to have my beautiful family. My brother is here, my sister is here, who was both in the film, and my 2 nieces and my 2 nephews, and it's wonderful to have them here. And there are at least a half dozen people from the Equal Justice Initiative. I don't do this work alone here. Every day they go into jails and prisons, they go into the communities to facilitate these conversations, and they are making this work happen. And I'm really grateful to people like Jackie Oliver and Trey Ellison, the Kuhnhart family, for the extraordinary care they took in telling this story. But I do think that we need all of you to get engaged, to be involved. I want everybody to come to Montgomery and visit our museum and memorial. I really do. For us, it symbolizes, it represents a kind of commitment to kind of turning the page. We invite people to learn about this information, to kind of join us in this truth-telling we're doing on a daily basis on our website. We want people to begin to be in conversation with us about this. But you're right to kind of reference love, because the one part of this story that I don't think has been articulated the way we need to, when you look at the history of brutality of African people, of African Americans, and emancipation comes, it would have been completely understandable for black people to hate white people, to want to punish and to arm themselves and do violence against those who did violence to them. And they chose not to do that. And even when they were promised something that they didn't get, and they were being terrorized and lynched and menaced and forced from their lands, there was still a commitment to not hate back. And the power of Dr. King and the civil rights leadership is it would have been really easy to hate those who were brutalizing them, but instead they put on their Sunday best and they positioned themselves to be brutalized because they believed that love was more powerful than hate. And so I am the heir of a community of people who have taught me to love even when it seems irrational, because there is something powerful about love. And I don't, like my client Ray Hinton, I'm unwilling to give in to hate and vengeance and retribution, because I don't think it's a place where we can survive. And I think that's really what sustains me. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less, and they didn't have films made about them. And I want to honor that witness. I want to honor that legacy by continuing this commitment, to preach redemption and restoration, to preach love over hate, to preach the kind of freedom that I think awaits us if we have the courage to achieve it. And I can only do it with the great staff that we have at EJI and the wonderful people that I get to work with, and with people like you who become engaged and join this effort on a daily basis.
Well, here's to engagement and compassion.
Thank you.
Let's give Mr. Stevenson a round of applause.